of all, Zacchaeus was a tax collector. But Luke 19 tells us, and this is, you'll find it only in this chapter of your Bible, he's not just a tax collector, he is the chief tax collector. What that means is Zacchaeus more than likely was over other tax collectors. Now already we can sense the tension here because nobody really likes tax collectors, do they? I mean, we're not all that excited about the IRS. We're not all that excited about paying taxes. I was preaching one time from Luke 19. I was making this point about, nobody really likes tax collectors, do they? And I'd forgotten I had a guy in the very back of the church, Lee O'Rear, who was actually a tax collector. He came up to me afterwards and says, I kind of like my job. Well, in the ancient world, people didn't really like a tax collector because a tax collector was in league with the Romans. You know this. How that this tax collector lined his pockets on the money he would take from his own people. The Roman government would use Jewish people. They would become tax collectors, and so tax collectors were seen as folks who were unscrupulous. And so the Jews didn't like tax collectors, and the Romans, there was this racial thing going on. The Romans didn't like the Jews either. And so as we think about Zacchaeus, we can think about someone, though he was powerful, we can think of someone who struggled relationally. Verse 2 says that he was also rich. It was very lucrative being a tax collector. And so imagine, here's a man with plenty of money, plenty of power, but he's lacking in relationships. And so Zacchaeus hears the rumor that Jesus is going to pass through Jericho, and he's heard that Jesus is a friend of tax collectors and sinners. And so Zacchaeus wants to know if all of this is true. If Jesus really is a friend of tax collectors and sinners. So here's Zacchaeus. He is a tax collector. He is wealthy. And then there's one other little detail. We find out that he is short in stature. We wonder, how short was Zacchaeus? He must have been very short for the text to highlight that idea. It's not that he was just kind of, average height. No. He was short. So short, in fact, that he had to run around to get this view of Jesus. This week, I wondered to myself, what was the average height of a person in first century Palestine? I found out the average height was like 5'5". So imagine he's much shorter than 5'5", He's like Kevin Hart short. I mean, this guy is very short. And so here's someone, because of his profession, because he's seen as a turncoat, and now he's shorter in stature. This is someone who is being overlooked. And yet he wants a glimpse of Jesus. Now, what would motivate him to do what he did? Luke doesn't tell us, but something must be happening in his heart. Think for a moment about Zacchaeus. He hears Jesus is coming to town. Large crowd gathers. He realizes, well, I can't see over the crowd. I'll just run around, and there's a tree I see, and I'll climb up that tree so I can get a better look. My question to you is, who climbs trees? I tell you, the same people climb trees in the ancient world that climbs trees right now, and that is children, that is kids. Understand this, rich, powerful, well-known man in Jericho looks like a fool. He looks silly climbing this tree. And I want to know what would motivate him to put himself in this position. What would motivate him to look silly? Because he wants to see Jesus. Something is going on deep in his heart. And so maybe today you've come and you might feel a little bit like Zacchaeus. It's not that you're short of stature, but maybe you're short on hope or short on purpose or short on acceptance, short on love. You see, as we think about what was it that moved or motivated Zacchaeus, it's the same thing that moves us. We want love. We want acceptance. We want relationships, and those are deficits in Zacchaeus' life. And so he runs around and he's now in this tree and he's looking down. Jesus comes by. And there's something fascinating in this text that I don't know that I've ever really thought about before until this week. Jesus looks up and he calls Zacchaeus by name. Now, here's the question. How did Jesus know Zacchaeus' name? There's no indication that Zacchaeus had met Jesus earlier. No one had introduced Zacchaeus to Jesus. Jesus knows who we are. Zacchaeus would say today, if he were to give his testimony, Jesus really saw me. Oftentimes we can go through this world and we feel like we're never really seen. That was Zacchaeus. People were making a wide path around him. They didn't want to be near Zacchaeus. And yet Jesus looks and he sees this man who obviously has things going on in his heart. And he calls Zacchaeus by name. There's a story that Mary Ann Bird tells about herself. She was this little girl who struggled to be accepted and loved because she was born with so many birth defects. She had a cleft palate. She had a misshapen lip. And so in her mind, she thought to herself, no one else could love me outside my family. And then when she went to school, it only made matters worse because you know how kids are, and sort of kids drew attention to how she looked and how she sounded when she spoke. And in fact, when she was asked about her lips, she would often say, well, I fell and cut it on a piece of glass. Mary Ann Bird was in the second grade, and her second grade teacher was a woman by the name of Mrs. Leonard, and she described Mrs. Leonard as this short, round woman who had a heart of gold. All the kids loved her. And every year they would have a hearing test. They called it a whisper test. Mrs. Leonard would call the students up to her desk. They would stand near her desk. They would put one hand over one ear, and Mrs. Leonard would repeat a phrase to the children. She would say something like, the sky is blue, and they would need to repeat it back. Or, do you have new shoes? And finally it was time for Mary Ann Bird to walk up and experience the whisper test. And Mary Ann Bird said that Mrs. Leonard uttered words to her that God himself must have put on her heart, because those 7 words, she said, changed my life. As this little girl stood up there in second grade with so many issues, so many struggles, wondering, am I loved and accepted? Could anybody love and accept me? Her second grade teacher whispered to her, I wish you were my little girl. So here's Zacchaeus. He's in the tree, and he hears his name called. And there's something powerful when we hear someone use our name, Zacchaeus. And then there's another surprise in the story. Jesus does something that in that culture really wasn't acceptable, and it's not so much acceptable in our culture either. In verse 5, Jesus says this. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house. Now, I'm very careful about inviting people to our house because I don't want to just spring things on Janet. Probably in my ministry life, I may have done that a time or two, but now I'm older and more mature, and I want to make sure before I invite others over for dinner or whatever, I want to make sure that the calendar is clear and that the house is clean and that we don't have anything else going on, and it is okay. But Jesus is not inviting somebody to his house. Jesus looks up at Zacchaeus and he says, Zacchaeus, I want you to come down here. I'm coming to your house today. And not only is Jesus inviting himself over to his house, but understand, Jesus wasn't traveling alone. Jesus has 12 other men with him, maybe a few other people, and so it's a rather large group. Jesus would come, the others would come as well. Think about Mrs. Zacchaeus. Now, certainly, they had room in their house. They were probably the wealthiest people in town. They had the money to provide for a large group of people, but I think Mrs. Zacchaeus may have liked to have known ahead of time. And then on top of that, they're traveling to Jerusalem. They're coming through. Jerusalem's about 15 miles to the north of Jericho. And so after the meal and after the conversation, it would have been too late for them to journey on to Jerusalem, so probably they would have spent the night at Zacchaeus' house as well. It's a surprise that Jesus invites himself over to Zacchaeus' house. But really, the other thing that's incredibly surprising, and this may be the biggest